Under the scorching sun of the savannah, a faint, mournful cry pierced the stillness, catching the attention of an old woman, Mama Asha. Her hunched figure moved slowly through the tall grass, pausing as she heard the sound. Her heart raced as she listened carefully, then cautiously followed the noise. Her basket, filled with collected branches, weighed heavily in her hand. The sun hung low in the sky, bathing the land in golden light. The nearby village of Bobab was far away, and her life of solitude had taught her to rely only on herself. But this cry wouldn't let her go. As the grass parted before her, a small, trembling creature was revealed. Its fur was as white as clouds, its eyes filled with fear and innocence. Mama Asha's breath caught, an albino baboon, alone and helpless. Slowly, without haste, she knelt and extended a hand. "Easy now, little one," she murmured softly, her voice warm and soothing. The tiny creature flinched, retreating, but Mama Asha remained patient, motionless, her open palm offering no threat. After what seemed like an endless silence, the little baboon cautiously moved forward, its small fingers hesitantly touching the rough, weathered hands of the old woman. A smile flickered across her face as she gently scooped him into her arms. He was feather light, his body trembling, but his warmth was real. "You're safe now," she whispered as he nestled against her chest. As she made her way back to her hut, she spoke to him in a calm voice. "I'll call you Kayani," she said softly. "You'll be my little hope." The days passed, and the once frightened Kayani grew bolder. At first, he clung to Mama Asha's clothes, hiding between her feet or silently watching her. But with each passing week, his confidence grew. He followed her through the grass, mimicked her movements, and learned from her. One morning, as she gathered firewood as usual, Kayani bounded around her with newfound energy, his white fur gleaming in the sun, his curious eyes examining every object she touched. "You're quite the helper," Mama Asha laughed as he tried to place a small stick in her basket. The months went by, and the fragile baboon grew into a strong, intelligent creature. Kayani learned to carry wood, gather fruit from the tall baobab trees, and even fetch water from the stream. He was more than a companion, he was family, but not everyone saw him that way. In the village of Bobab, rumors began to spread. "A white baboon? That's not natural," some whispered. "He's too big, too clever. Maybe he's a curse." Mama Asha ignored the talk. To her, Kayani was a blessing, a miracle. But the villagers' fear grew, and with it, the danger to the loyal baboon. One day, as they entered the village, conversations fell silent, and all eyes turned to Kayani. Men exchanged uneasy glances, and women held their children close. "He doesn't belong here," a trader said, stepping back. "Take that creature and leave." Mama Asha lifted her chin. "He's not a creature. He's my family." But her words couldn't ease their fear, and as they left the village, she felt a dark foreboding for the first time. Kayani, however, understood only one thing. They feared him, and fear could be more dangerous than any wilderness. The following night, Mama Asha lay awake. The wind whispered through the savannah, and the distant howl of a jackal sent a shiver down her spine. She looked over at Kayani, who slept beside her hut, his white fur shimmering in the moonlight. "What will become of you, my boy?" she murmured softly, gazing at his silhouette. The next morning, Mama Asha set out for the stream, accompanied by Kayani. He carried a small basket in his strong arms, glancing up at her as if seeking reassurance. "You're so clever," she said affectionately, stroking his head, "but people fear what they don't understand." That day, they crossed paths with a hunter from the village. The man stopped abruptly when he saw Kayani. "What are you doing out here with that thing?" he asked suspiciously. Mama Asha replied calmly, "He's not a thing. He's my friend." The hunter shook his head and walked on, but his eyes were full of doubt. Mama Asha knew the day would come when she could no longer protect Kayani, but for as long as she could, she would love him like a son. The days passed, and Kayani continued to grow. His once shy nature transformed into confidence, but he remained gentle and playful. Mama Asha taught him to handle things carefully, not to knock over her baskets, and to move with caution. Yet despite his consideration, No one could overlook that Kayani was now almost as large as a human. His white fur made him even more conspicuous, a glowing shadow darting through the savanna. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky red, Kayani sat on the roof of Mama Asha's hut, gazing at the horizon. A deep sense of unease washed over him. In the village of Bobab, the people hadn't forgotten him, and their fear only seemed to grow. Every time Mama Asha went to the village, she felt the suspicious stares of the villagers. Some avoided her, while others muttered behind her back. One day as she was at the market, a group of men approached her. Their leader, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, spoke sharply. Mama Asha, it's time you got rid of that thing. It's unnatural, and it's scaring people. Mama Asha looked him in the eye. Kayani isn't a thing. He's my family. No one has ever cared for him but me. The man scowled. He's too big, too strong. What if he's not so gentle one day? What if he turns on us? Mama Asha replied calmly. If he stays as he is, will you still fear him? The men hesitated, but their fear outweighed their reason. We'll give you until the next full moon, the leader said. After that, we don't want to see him here anymore. With a heavy heart, Mama Asha returned to her hut. Kayani, always by her side, sensed her sadness. He rested his head on her lap and looked up at her with large golden eyes. Oh, my boy, she whispered, stroking his soft fur. I don't know what to do. In the weeks that followed, the village of Bobab grew restless. Rumors spread that Kayani was dangerous, though he had never harmed anyone. Some said he was a demon, a sign from the gods, or even a curse that had fallen upon the village. Others claimed they had heard him speak or that he could read minds. One evening, as Mama Asha sat quietly on her porch, Kayani came to her and sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was slowly setting behind the hills. I wish they could see you as I see you, Mama Asha whispered softly. Kayani gently placed his hand on hers. The day before the full moon, as the sky glowed a deep orange, Mama Asha noticed a group of village men gathering at the edge of the savanna. They watched her hut from a distance, whispering among themselves, seemingly planning something. The unease in Mama Asha's heart grew. She knew the time had come to make a decision. Kayani sensed her worry. He looked up at her, his golden eyes filled with understanding. Mama Asha gently stroked his head. It's time, my boy, she said softly. We have to make a choice. Kayani didn't understand the words, but he felt the gravity in her voice. He placed his large hand gently on her shoulder, as if to say, I'm with you. As night fell, Mama Asha heard the voices of the villagers in the distance. Some sounded uncertain, others resolute. She knew Kayani couldn't stay, but where could he go? Could he survive alone in the wild? Her thoughts swirled as Kayani sat quietly beside her. The next morning, as the sun slowly rose, Mama Asha stood and gazed at Kayani for a long time. Maybe there's still hope, she murmured. Maybe one day they'll understand. Kayani watched her, his eyes full of trust. And then the decision was made. The sun was already high in the sky when Mama Asha slowly opened her eyes. Her gaze fell on Kayani, who sat at the edge of the hut, watching the distance with a vigilant expression. Since the conversation with the villagers, he had grown restless, as if sensing the tension in the air. Mama Asha sighed softly. She knew they didn't have much time left. That day she decided to gather firewood farther away than usual. Kayani followed her silently, leaping lightly from tree to tree, always close by. Yet despite the beauty of the nature around them, Mama Asha couldn't shake her worries. The village men had set a deadline, and she didn't know what to do. As she picked up gnarled branches, she noticed Kayani pause. His ears twitched, and he stood upright. He had heard something. Mama Asha set down her branches and listened. It was faint, barely audible, a sound that didn't blend with the usual noises of the savanna. Footsteps. Suddenly, 3 men burst from the bushes. They were villagers, armed with spears and determined expressions. Mama Asha, one of them said, you know why we're here. Kayani stepped protectively in front of her, his golden eyes gleaming with resolve. Mama Asha placed a hand on his arm. Please, she said calmly. He's never harmed anyone. The leader of the men shook his head. He's grown too big, too strong. We can't take the risk. He has to go. Mama Asha knew she couldn't change their minds. Let's go, she whispered to Kayani. Slowly she stepped back, but one of the men raised his spear. Kayani growled deeply. "No!" Mama Asha cried. "Don't run from fear. He's not your enemy." But it was too late. One of the men hurled his spear. Kayani dodged, leaped high, and landed behind Mama Asha. His white fur gleamed in the sun, his muscles tense. He could have attacked, but he didn't. The men hesitated as they saw his stance. He wasn't wild or uncontrollable. He was only protecting. "Maybe," one of the men murmured, but the leader cut him off. We end this now." Kayani knew there was no point in fighting. He let out a deep sound, then ran. He dashed through the grass, faster than any human could. Mama Asha watched him go, her heart heavy. She knew he had to leave, but it tore her apart. The men watched her, saying nothing, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Mama Asha stood there for a long time, until the sound of their footsteps faded. Tears glistened in her old eyes. "Run, my boy," she whispered. "Run and find your way." Kayani ran and ran until the savanna blurred in the distance. His heart raced, his legs moving as if on their own. The savanna stretched endlessly before him, but he didn't know where to go. He followed the instinctive call of the wild, onward and onward. After hours, he stopped and looked back. Mama Asha's small hut was no longer visible. His breath was heavy, but he couldn't stay still. In the distance, he saw a large valley lined with ancient trees whose branches offered shade. Here he could hide. Here he could survive. But the loneliness that enveloped him was overwhelming. The days passed and Kayani tried to adapt to life in the wild. He climbed tall trees to search for fruit, drank from clear streams, and listened to the sounds of the forest. But something was missing in his heart. Every night, as the wind rustled through the leaves, he remembered Mama Asha, her voice, her touch, the home he had lost. One night, as the moon hung high in the sky, he heard the distant howl of a jackal. It didn't sound threatening, but lonely, just like him. Kayani lifted his head and let out a deep call, an answer that echoed through the valley. He wasn't alone, even if it felt that way. As he gazed at the starry sky, he knew he had to find a new path, one that might one day lead him home. In the following days, Kayani ventured deeper into the wild. The trees were taller here, the shadows denser, and the sounds of the night unfamiliar. He didn't know where he was going, but he had to keep moving. Each step took him farther from Mama Asha, but her face remained in his heart. The first night in this new environment was cold. Kayani curled up under a large tree, his white fur offering little protection against the biting chill. He missed the warmth of the small hut, the soft hum of Mama Asha's voice when she spoke to him. But now he was alone. The next morning he set out to find food. He found a stream with fresh, clear water and drank greedily. Then he began picking fruit from a low bush. Suddenly there was a rustling in the underbrush. Kayani froze, his heart pounding in his chest, as two golden eyes shimmered from the shadows. A leopard. It was sleek but muscular, its spotted coat standing out against the foliage. The predator's eyes locked onto Kayani, who slowly backed away. He knew he stood no chance in a fight. His muscles tensed, ready to flee, but in that moment, the leopard let out a deep, warning growl. Not an attack, but a caution. Then it turned and disappeared silently into the trees. Kayani remained, his heart still racing. This wasn't Mama Asha's peaceful hut. This was the wild, and he had to learn to adapt. The days passed, and Kayani became more skilled at survival. He found ways to reach high branches to pluck sweet fruit. He learned to interpret the movements of the animals around him, knowing when danger was near and when it was safe. But in his dreams, he still heard Mama Asha's gentle voice. Her loss weighed heavily on him. One morning, he stumbled upon something unexpected. In a small clearing stood an old, half-collapsed hut. Its walls were covered in moss, the roof partially caved in, but Kayani recognized it immediately. It was a place where humans had once lived. He cautiously approached. Inside, it smelled of earth and old wood. An overturned table lay in one corner, and remnants of a fireplace were still visible. Kayani slowly sat down on the floor, letting his gaze wander. For the first time in days, he didn't feel entirely lost. In the following days, he made the old hut his home. He gathered dry branches and stacked them in a corner. He found a spot by the stream where he could drink regularly. Yet despite his efforts, he felt lonely. Then one evening, he heard voices, human voices. He quickly hid in the shadows of the hut and peered out. A small group of hunters approached the clearing. Their faces were tense, their bodies poised. Kayani recognized their posture. It was the same as the men from the village who had driven him away. One of the men stepped closer to the hut. "Someone's been staying here," he murmured, picking up one of the branches Kayani had gathered. "But who?" Kayani knew he couldn't be discovered. He retreated further into the shadows, his heart pounding. But then one of the men took a step toward the door. Kayani knew he had no choice. He tensed and bolted, crashing through the dense underbrush, his arms helping him swing from branch to branch. The hunters called to each other and gave chase, but Kayani was faster. The wild had become his home, and he knew it better than his pursuers. His breath was heavy, but his body was strong. He wouldn't give up. After a while, he slowed his pace. He heard the hunters' voices behind him, but they were growing fainter. He had shaken them off. He climbed a large tree and hid among the leaves, waiting. Below, the men searched aimlessly, but found no trace of him. As night fell, calm returned. Kayani stayed in his hiding spot, listening. The fear within him turned to determination. He couldn't go back, but he would find a new path. Somewhere out there was a place for him. He just had to find it. The sun rose over the savanna, bathing the land in warm golden light. Kayani sat high in an ancient tree, his golden eyes watching the vast plain below. The past weeks had been lonely, but he had learned to survive in this new world. Yet his heart longed for something he couldn't name, a place where he didn't just survive, but lived. In the distance, he saw a group of animals drinking peacefully at a watering hole. Kayani recognized zebras and antelopes, but his attention was drawn to another movement. He saw a small monkey clumsily clinging to a branch, desperately trying to reach the safety of the ground. Without hesitation, Kayani leaped from branch to branch until he was above the frightened creature. With a gentle motion, he reached down, grabbed it, and carefully set it on the ground. The little monkey looked up at him with wide, astonished eyes before scurrying back into its mother's arms. Kayani watched them, a strange feeling spreading through him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone, but the peace didn't last. A foreign scent filled the air. Smoke. Kayani looked into the distance and saw a dark column rising. His heart raced. He knew fire in the savanna was a great danger. He quickly climbed a higher branch, trying to locate the source of the smoke. What he saw made him freeze. The fire was coming from the direction of BABOON village. Without thinking, Kayani leaped from the tree and ran. His powerful legs carried him faster than he had ever run before. The wind roared in his ears, his thoughts racing. He didn't know what awaited him, but he had to go. When he reached the village, chaos had erupted. Flames consumed several huts. Smoke stung the eyes of the people desperately trying to douse the fire with buckets of water. Children cried. Animals ran in panic. It was a sight that shook Kayani. For a moment he hesitated. Would they fear him again? Would they drive him away once more? But then he heard a scream. An old woman was trapped near a collapsing hut. Without hesitation, he ran. He grabbed a large beam with his strong arms and hurled it aside. The woman stumbled forward, looking at him with wide eyes, not with fear, but with gratitude. Kayani looked around. He could help, and he would. He grabbed large buckets of water, dousing the flames, pulling villagers out of danger. The people watched him in disbelief until someone shouted, "Help him!" Suddenly, they worked side by side with him. Fear turned to hope, mistrust to trust. Kayani was no longer an outsider. He was one of them. Hours later, when the flames had finally died down and the smoke cleared, the village stood together. They were exhausted, but they were safe. Mesbaraka stepped forward and looked at Kayani for a long time. "You're not a curse," he said finally. "You're a blessing. You saved us." Kayani blinked. He didn't understand every word, but he felt their meaning. The villagers smiled at him. A small boy ran up and held out a piece of fruit, a silent gesture of acceptance. Kayani took it gently, feeling something shift within him. He was no longer alone. In the days that followed, Kayani helped with the rebuilding. He carried wood, fetched water, and played with the children. The people no longer looked at him with fear, but with respect and affection. The village had accepted him. He had become part of something greater. And so, one evening, Kayani sat on a rock at the edge of the village, gazing out over the vast savanna. The stars twinkled above him, and in the distance he could hear the voices of the people laughing and sharing stories. He remembered Mama Asha, her warmth, her love. She had given him a home, and now he had found a new one. He had arrived.